an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering The Wall of Storms, Dandelion Dynasty Book 2, Chapters 12 and 13, Crescent Island, and Merchants and Farmers. In these chapters, Zomi is out here on an island learning logograms, which are actually super interesting to me, and I really, really want to, take this up as a hobby. And then there is an awkward, very open confrontation between the Empress and Jin, and it is a bad look for Jin. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everybody. I am Natasha. So first of all, this episode is basically a holdover from the last time I recorded or was it the last time, or it might have been the time before, but one of the episodes that I did for Wall of Storms, for some reason, there was a horrible problem with either my microphone or the connection or something, and it wound up garbled and like a total mess. And I didn't realize until afterwards, because initially I thought the problem had been with GarageBand, and I was like, oh, no problem. Once it's time for me to post it, I'll just pull the audio from the Crowdcast, which will be fine. Well, it was not. The Crowdcast was just as fucked up as the GarageBand file. So clearly there was something with my computer going on, and it was not like a program. So I felt really bad because it was practically unlistenable. And I told Kyle, who had commissioned the episode, hey, I'm going to owe you for this. I will do another one for free because I feel really bad. And then I forgot that I had said that. And I never set anything up with him. And I suddenly remembered it all at once the other day when I had a weird error with a different file. I was like, oh my God, wait, that other one that I did so long ago, and I said I would make it up to him and I didn't. So here I am. And I'm really glad to get back to this book for a second because it's been a minute. I feel like it was almost a month since the last episode, or maybe longer. And this book is really interesting, because there is such a focal point being made of Zomi and her thesis that is being really drawn out. And when I say drawn out, it makes it sound like I'm like, oh God, you're taking forever. And there's a part of me that does feel that way just because the suspense is killing me. But I don't feel like this is gratuitous, really. It's just that I'm impatient to hear what she has to say. And also, it's a very different feel from the other book, in which the plot moved rapidly. I mean, things just happened, kings rose and fell within the same 2-3 chapters. So this is a really different feel. And I wasn't totally ready for the change. And I also think that part of my discomfort right now is stemming from the fact that I don't like seeing characters that I have grown to really enjoy fall to infighting, which is what's going on. It's not unrealistic. That's the thing. It's not like I think this author is doing something really cheap, because that can happen. I mean, especially, the thing that always comes to mind for me is something like a soap opera, where you just really need for there to be story. So you throw in people acting unreasonably, or maybe against character even a little bit, in order to develop some sort of drama. But instead, this feels like the natural progression of people who grew together during a really formative moment, and then that formative moment, they actually reach their goal in terms of uniting the country in a certain way. And once they've reached their goal and they've like taken this ride with each other, they don't know what to do now that it's kind of time to get off that ride. And this is sad in some ways to realize that a lot of us need a really firm, we not only need a firm goal and a firm vision, but some of us are people who work best with others when we are united against a common enemy. And when that enemy is gone and we're needing to work together for the sake of peace or simply to like do what's best, it's a lot harder for us to set things aside. And we often justify that by saying, well, yeah, it's peacetime now. And we each have different ideas of what it means to be at peace and what it means to take care of the people who are depending on us. And Jin clearly thinks that she is doing what is best for the people in her area. But that's the difference between, I think, Jia and Jin, is that Jia is like, what's best for the people, period. And Jin is like, what's best for the people in the territory that I rule, because I want them to continue to like and support me. And so part of me lost a little bit of respect for Jin through this little interaction, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Kyle says, this is definitely the draggiest part of the book, but it's necessary for things going forward. And yeah, I don't even think it's draggy really, Kyle. I think it's just because it's broken up the way that I cover it, that for me, I'm like, oh my God, I just want to hear her thesis. What is it? But I really don't think if I were reading this the normal way that I would be bothered by this. I think I would still be very engaged. And it's not really bothering me now. It's just, I just really want to know. So, okay, let's back up to chapter 12. And I want to say also thank you, Kyle, for telling me exactly what chapters to read each episode, because it can get a little tricky for me with other books. And it is super duper helpful to just go to the spreadsheet and be like, yep, he said these two. Okay. And there it is. And I'm done. So chapter 12, Crescent Island, the first year in the reign of 4 placid seas, 5 years before the first grand examination. Now, I keep on forgetting that even though this is Zomi as a child and she is like still learning shit, the grand examination is only 5 years out from this. Like, 5 years isn't that long. And, you know, when you're young, it feels like a long time, and it's certainly huge developmentally. So she's going to be a very different person, but it's still, she's very young taking this examination, you know? So I'm fascinated to see exactly what she decides to do. So they are still in their balloon, she and Luan. And there is this like island that they see below that we find out is kind of set aside from the rest of civilization in a way. It says the landscape was a patchwork of shield volcanoes with miles and miles of frozen, ropey lava flow on which barely anything grew, as though the gods had carved ruts into a muddy road with massive carriages, and dense forests divided by rugged mountains where the fauna and flora between neighboring valleys were as different as 2 islands divided by the open ocean, which is really cool. I am sure that there is an ecosystem in our universe that is similar to this, where things are drastically different from one side to another. I don't know enough about our geography to be able to comment on that, but I have heard things like this, especially like there are places where there are sinkholes and whatnot, where like that one sinkhole on the planet is the only place that you can find this particular species of lizard or something. And I just am so fascinated by that like phenomenon, and the idea that there's almost like a whole other world happening within this tiny little microcosm on our Earth. And it's just really fascinating to me. And it's one of those things that makes me a little bit like cranky when in sci-fi they'll land on a planet and they'll step out of the fucking ship doors and look around and be like, oh, this is the desert planet. And I'm like, bitch, you're looking at like a fucking 1 mile radius. You land in our Gobi Desert, you're going to think we're a desert planet. And guess what? I've got news for you. We're like 60-70% ocean. There's always this feel of just like, oh yeah, we just looked out the window to tell what kind of planet it is. Like, how about you just take a look around for a second? And how neat would it be if aliens landed here and they landed in like a sinkhole ecosystem and they were like, oh, this is what the entire Earth is like. And then they're finding out, years later, oh, wow, no, we were super duper wrong about that. And as they're flying over it, there is this poem that we are told. Some of the kings of old Amu became obsessed with collecting them all and spent more time hunting than administering. And the Amu poet Nakipo, who was also renowned as a lady of fashion at the Mooning court, once wrote, "Crescents by your snout, so crescent in the sea. You've seized the king's heart, my beautiful wild glee." Which is kind of wild. But yeah, this is in reference to him hunting wild boar, which seemed to develop tusks of different shapes and sizes and coloration in each of the hundreds of valleys. So yeah, that's so cool. I just love this idea of all of this wildlife here, because it's not like wildlife doesn't play an important role. I mean, the Krubans themselves have been hugely important to the story, but it's not something that we have seen on land as being the same. It's been a lot of ocean stuff because they're at war and they're trying to utilize this stuff. So this is cool. And these like islands, they've kind of fallen outside of the jurisdiction of the empire. They don't pay taxes. They don't follow the laws because people don't really live there who are politically significant. Apparently, there had been a time where the emperor had been trying to give away land on these islands to people who were who had done good for the empire. And Kunyu was like, all right, well, there's this whole island that nobody's really doing much with if you want it. But then it turns out that the soil isn't really good for cultivation, and it's so far away from everything else that people who felt like they had really done something for the empire were not keen to live this far from civilization. And so it just kind of wound up becoming its own little pocket lost in time, where people continue to speak an older version of the language. People continue to use older versions of logograms, and they keep to customs that when Zomi sees them, she sees their clothing and the way that they greet her and Luan, and it's genuinely the kind of thing that you would see for at a play. And so what I like to think of here is, imagine if we landed on an island and there were people still wearing Elizabethan ruffs and tunics and gowns, and they curtsied and did elaborate bows and spoke in the Queen's speech when we landed, and how totally bizarre that would be to us. What happened here? It's obviously a very extreme example because that's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And I don't know that it feels totally like it's that far back, but I don't think it's that far off. So Zomi is looking out of the balloon and she's like, okay, she points out this area and she's like, that seems like a good landing spot. And Luan's like, yeah, that seems like a perfect landing spot. So why don't you go ahead and do that? And she's like, maybe you should do it. And he says something about how she is going to need to learn, and she can either use her failure as a learning opportunity or she can give up. And we find out that she had landed the balloon another time. And it's said that she landed so bumpily that the gondola tipped over and just kind of threw her and Luan onto the ground. But honestly, even if that is what happened, for your very first time landing this isn't that bad, Zomi. That's pretty good. You're a child learning how to operate a very sort of what's the word I want? A machine that's sort of at the whims of the weather. It's very unpredictable, I think. And I wouldn't be ashamed of that on your first try. And this time she decides to like listen to Luan and be very deliberate and careful about how she does the landing. And she manages to do it without too much of a bump. And as they're landing and she sees the people that are like coming out to greet them, she notices their clothes and stuff. And she's just like, wow, they are wearing old fashioned shit. And they land. She does a good job. Luan is proud of her. And she asks him about, because he says, after generations of living away from the ever-changing fashion on the other islands, they're like a still pool by the side of a rushing river, a world unto themselves. And she says, you sound like you almost envy them. Do you want to live like that away from everyone else? And Luan is like, depends on when you ask me. If I'm living in the city, I'm going to miss nature and the quiet. If I'm in nature, I really miss the city and all of the people and the things to do. And she says, it sounds like you're not ever happy. And he's like, I'm kind of not. Like, you're not wrong, which is rough. But yeah, this landing, they're greeted by some people who are speaking the vernacular of Amu. And she's like, this doesn't sound like the Amu that I know about. Is this how they talked 30 generations ago? And he says, not exactly. The way we speak changes quickly. Have you not noticed how even elders in your village do not speak the exact same way you do? Which is kind of cool. This is like, it's not like a whole other language, but it's very differently done. And there are so many things that I think we take for granted about the way we speak today that really are strange to folks who are older. I mean, he says something at this point about how speech changes a lot more quickly than the written word. And I would have said that was a lot more accurate before the Industrial Revolution, and especially before the last 20 years of tech really like burgeoning, because this has changed the way that we write in an enormous way that I think we're only just beginning to see the results of. And when I say that, I'm talking about, of course, things like acronyms, just, SMH, FML, like we know what that means, but we don't have to say it out. Like we can just go LOL out loud. We can just say the letters LOL and somebody will know not only that we mean laugh out loud, but the fact that we chose to say the letters LOL means that we don't actually find it that funny. Like it's the fact that we're using text speak in normal speech sometimes is really fascinating to me. And then, there's the whole other, like those of you who are on pages with pets, you guys know that there's like an entirely new subset of language that is specific to how you talk about animals, right? So there are a million groups that are like, this cat is chonky. This cat is necky. And it means this is a group for fat cats. This is a group for cats with no fur. And it's just, you're in these groups and they're like, him do a naughty. And it's like fucking another language. HIMB do a naughty. And it's like NAWTTY. Like totally fucking different spelling. But we have grown to like know what this means if we're in that community. And so when he says that written language doesn't change that quickly, that was once true, I think, because we were running right up against one another in real time, immediately seeing a joke somebody made and adopting it and using that in a group with 40,000 people who all saw the same joke, all liked it, and all began to make that same joke themselves on other things. And in a week is just in the parlance. And I just find language to be like one of those things that part of me is really prescriptive, and I want things to be spelled the way they've always been spelled. I want things to, like, I want the grammar rules to be followed. I want people to, like, take some pride in the way that they write things. But then I love weird pet speak. And it's not like I even do it myself very often. I just find it fascinating to read and to follow the progression of it as things change. And I love to see how differently everybody reacts to these changes, because some older people get very into pet speak. It's not like it's just young people who do this. Older people get into it too. But then there are older people who see it as like really childish and kind of an affront to language. And how the world at large reacts will determine how this goes down. If it's going to continue on this way for, you know, more generations, or if it's going to sort of die off, and if this is like a fad in the way of speaking, I don't know. But anyway, so they are communicating with this old man who doesn't share the same language with Luan. Like, Luan can speak back just enough to do a basic greeting. And then they sit down across from one another and they're sharing tea and these little cakes that they are made with like rice and coconut on the outside. And in the center is like a papaya. But it's not papaya. She says it's like it. And that sounds super good to me. I really I need to try a little bit more in the way of snacks that are sort of elaborate, but centered around fruit, rather than doing what I do, which is trying to make everything like a baked good from fucking, you know, tea time in Britain. Cause this sounds like it would be lovely and feel really like, luxurious to eat, but also wouldn't be like horrible for you. And Luan and this old man are handing back and forth a clay tablet that they are carving symbols into. And they each are like, the old man can't even see the logograms. He has to feel them with his fingers to tell what they say. But I think it's kind of dope that this default, like the writing of logograms is a thing that are done everywhere, right? Like, and yet it's also something that does lend itself to a person who's blind still being able to use that method of communication versus the way that we write now on paper, and a blind person needs a braille version of it in order to be able to read it. And it's just a shame that like we don't have things be more accessible by default, because I just, you know, it's just a shame. I saw a meme the other day where somebody was comparing the price of like the Harry Potter print version versus the Kindle version versus the Braille version. And the Braille version of Sorcerer's Stone is like $45, or it might have been even more than that. And while the arguments of like, well, more work goes into that and yada, yada, yada. And like, yeah, that all very well may be true, but that does not change the fact that for a blind person, they are paying quintuple the price for a single book. I mean, that fucking sucks. And it's a shame that we can't somehow subsidize things to make it easier on people who already have a fucking terrible time, because most of the world does not function to be welcoming to them and make them feel like they're part of things. And, you know, we just sort of, when you don't suffer from that same disability, we are able to sort of shrug our shoulders and just be like, well, I don't know what to tell you. That's the world. And we don't have to worry about it beyond that. But that person is out here living and trying to like do things the same way that we do. And they aren't experiencing anything like the same inclusivity. And I just thought it was really cool that this is a method of communication that isn't altered at all and still is like accessible to this man who can't see. So it turns out that what they do is propose a trade. And he has some stuff that he is going to trade for people to guide them up the side of the mountain. And meanwhile, Zomi is asking about the logograms because she has never learned these and she wants to know how they're speaking to one another here. And so she's asking what each of them means. And at first, they're very simple. You know, one of them is a series of like triangles, and it's the mountains. Another one is a person walking up and up the side of it, and it's somebody climbing. This is all pretty straightforward, right? But then he brings up about like the fact that there are going to be concepts that are abstract that you have to get across. One of them is trading. And the way that is depicted is like an open palm with a scallop shell beside it. And the scallop shell is used in this way because it was one of the first, like, one of the first, I'm trying to denote, like, one of the first monies they used, but I'm trying to figure out what the word is for money that I'm trying to talk about. But this is, so it means like, let's see where it is. Confiji said that it is not proper to laugh at those seeking knowledge. Oh, that's right. Because she asks, is that a fat winter melon? And is that a banana leaf? And Luan like starts fucking cracking up at her mistake. But let's see. And the fat winter melon is actually a closed fist, and the banana leaf is an open palm. A lot of Ano logograms incorporate stylized representations that are easy to carve but aren't very close to the original anymore. And let's see. Oh, yeah. So he asks her about, like, thinking of these in terms of a machine. And in a machine, there are lots of different parts. And each of them serves their own function, but when you put them together, they can do something entirely different. And so he's explaining that this is what all of these little symbols together in one square change the meanings of each other so much that it turns into an entirely different word. So, oh yeah, he's talking about the fact that writing and using different symbols can behave as different functions in a machine makes building machines and engineering something almost like poetry. And Zomi is into this idea. She fucking loves this analogy and really seems to cling to it in this way of just like, oh my God, this makes perfect fucking sense to me. So later on, she brings up that you never told me what the scallop shell is. And here it is. Oh, yeah. So putting them all together tells you that the logogram means trade. The ancient Ano used shells as their first currency. Fuck, currency. Thank you. That's the word that I wanted. Jesus Christ. So the scallop shell, there are hundreds of these semantic roots that you must learn to master the logograms. The hands are more complicated. They are motive modifiers, which means that they narrow and redefine the semantic root to point to a more specific meaning. The combination of the open hand and the closed fist is a standard way to represent change or transformation. Putting them all together tells you that this logogram means trade, or inkron in classical Ano. And she realizes that they were talking about doing a trade. And he then points out the other logograms, and she thinks they look like fish fillets. Like, she just keeps on getting it so wrong. But he points out that, like, no, you're treating these little symbols in there as if they're decoration. Those are significant. You have to look closely and pull apart every layer of this little drawing. So there's like little lines that end in a swirl or one that ends in like an arrow. And it's talking about like buying and selling and the way that you would say the word out loud, like whether the tongue is rolled or positioned between the teeth, which is kind of cool. And then inflection glyphs. They mark the conjugation of verbs and declension of nouns, adjectives, and pronouns. In formal writing, they're usually colored to make them easier to see and also for aesthetics, but in calligraphy, they're often omitted for a more elegant outline. Also, by changing the height or angle of the logograms, a writer can indicate tone, emphasis, but we're now probably getting too advanced. You'll pick these up in time. Yo, this sounds like my jam in terms of communication. It's like a giant puzzle that then you can, like, I just am fascinated by this. I want to learn this. I really do. So he starts showing her the way that, like, yeah, you can draw this mountain. And then if you sculpt the logogram for fire next to it, what do you think that does? And she's like, oh, that now it means volcano. And then he's like, all right, so if we put the motive modifier for blossom beside it, now what? And she says volcanic flower. And he's like, too literal. And then she's like blooming and she realizes, oh, a volcanic eruption. And then what if you take all of those and put the semantic root of air over heart, which means mind, and she puts it together that this means rage or fury. And he's like, damn, you're pretty quick, actually. Yes, that is exactly it. So he draws this poem. And this is so cool. Air, heart, fire, mountain, blossom. Air, heart, period. Fire, period. Mountain, period. Blossom, period. Fire blossom, period. Mountain, period. Air, period. Heart. And she's like, what the hell is that? And he's like, yeah, you won't get this quite yet because it's advanced, but I'll read it to you. Fury, a mind on fire, a flower of frozen lava. Open, my stony soul, a breeze over the heart. And apparently this was written by a poet, Nakipo, after an argument with one of her closest friends. And this is deemed one of the finest examples of the imagistic school of poetry popular in Old Amu. It really is beautiful, you know, like I love it. It was really, it's reminds you of like a really fucking killer haiku, you know? So at this point they get interrupted and Zomi is just fucking so taken with the whole concept of this sort of communication, just like I am in a way. And she's very distracted. And when these people turn up and they're just like, all right, time to take our walk. She's like, but I want to school more. So then we go into chapter 13 and we have jumped back ahead the third month in the 6th year of the reign of Four Placid Seas, back to the presentations of all of these different theses. And it is really amusing. So it says, one by one, the other Pana Meiji were introduced, and they presented their ideas with various degrees of panache. Some put on skits like kitetsu. Some unveiled models or illustrations. One had his servants run around the grand audience hall trying to fly some kites that were supposed to illustrate the elevated tone of his arguments. The lines got tangled and the kites crashed into balconies, leading to much embarrassment and jokes about the tangled skein of his logic. Another chose to engage the Lords of Dara by making them participants in a mini opera where they'd sing the chorus. That experiment fared about as well as one might expect. Now, this is one of those things that I know that this shit happens because I have seen many presentations of various types in which somebody really thought it was going to go one way and it went another way. And there are moments where you are like, oh, I don't know why people weren't more into that. I thought that was really cool. But sometimes there are moments where you're like, yo, why did you think that would ever work? What did you think you were saying? And who was the audience that you thought you were talking to? And this thing with the fucking kites, like, they're inside. They're not. What exactly do you think these kites are going to catch on to and be able to, like, float on? That's not how it works, man. Emperor Reagan quizzed each, jumping from their essays onto new subjects that seemed to interest him more. Now, clued into the true nature of the event, Thera was more appreciative of the stiff, odd answers given by the examinees, as well as the subtle flow of power in the grand audience room. It was as if the emperor, the Pana Meiji, and all the attendees at court were playing some elaborate game in which a conversation happened beneath the conversation, which is something that I think in power circles is always happening, you know. So then we have Noroko Huza from Gejira, which is Queen Jin's realm. And he gets up and he does this presentation, and it's this, basically, he has people on bicycles pedaling to give power to what is essentially a giant projector, and manages to play a movie, a very short movie, of all of the different items that are traded and that are like sort of the hallmarks of different regions of the islands, and show the map of Dara and the way that the ships like travel in order to trade from one place to the other. And it's very impressive, the technology of it, but in terms of its actually saying anything, it kind of doesn't. And I think Thera is thinking to herself a little bit later that this presentation is not something that her father is really going to like, because it's not subtle at all. It's just like, you know, it really, it's the only thing that is sort of, he's relying on everybody being completely enchanted by the method of showing this to them. Like the fact that he was able to do this sort of thing on film, and it's not actual film, but it's like paper. He is hoping that the razzle dazzle is going to be enough to distract from the fact that he didn't really say all that much. And I mean, I think we've all seen presentations like this where there was a lot that went into visually being very impressive, but when you pulled it apart, they weren't really doing much at all. So at this point, Kuni is like, all right, so what is it that you are trying to tell us here? Because he says, your presentation, while marvelous, was sparse on justification. Can you elaborate? You're protesting the imperial edict raising port imposts, among other policies, said Naroka. So Firo, behind the scenes, his kids are still watching, Kuni's kids. Firo says that was the best demonstration ever. I wish we could make moving pictures like that. And Thera, yeah, she's the one that says, this isn't a very subtle display. Naroka's family is very wealthy. Hundreds of artists must have worked nonstop since the grand examination to make that. Father isn't going to like that. I thought Da liked traders, whispered Firo. He's always going on about how much he did to protect them back when he was the Duke of Zudi. Remember that sometimes the Emperor must ask questions that aren't his, said Soto, and sometimes the answers he elicits are meant for other ears. So when we go on to Naroka, he's talking about how trade is incredibly important and that merchants don't really get the respect and appreciation that they deserve. And that things have changed a lot since the eras when you could be pretty much self-sufficient as a farmer in an area where your region was able to produce most of what you needed and you didn't have to rely on traders. But now there is a lot more interconnectedness between the different territories. Really what Naroka is talking about is globalization. And globalization is very much this same exact phenomenon of entire sections of the world being devoted to producing like one or two types of item, and the rest of the world depending on that section of the world for that thing, and that section of the world depending on the rest of the world needing it for all of its income and relevance. So that if something happens and their crop fails or something falls out of favor technologically, they need to rush to keep up, and they will often be paid less than what it's worth if there's a glut on the market. They are taken advantage of by the people who buy and sell their product for them on their behalf, because rarely are the manufacturers the same as the ones who are doing the buying and selling. It sometimes happens, and that's its own whole story. But here we're talking about traders who come in, buy a certain amount of something from a farmer or from a producer, And then they go and sell that thing somewhere else. So Gia, she is not fucking interested in entertaining this guy's argument. And she chimes in for the first time. And it really, like, there's a noticeable shift in the vibe of the room. Because pretty much everybody did not expect for her to chime in at all. And the fact that she has, when that's not really like an expectation, means that she really feels a way about this. So Naroka, she says something about, because he tries to say, well, times are changing. And she's like, times can change and the principles of things can still stay the same. And he's like, I mean, that's true, but the great spirited Ra Oji once said the ebb and flow of the sea were at the heart of every search for happiness. What does that fluxist adage have to do with the jangling of coins and bargaining for advantage? The essence of the tides is movement and change. It is the constant flow that prevents stagnation and refreshes life. To say that merchants produce nothing is a misunderstanding. We bring goods from places of abundance to where they're wanted, so that excess make up for shortage. The tide of commerce fulfills desires and spreads new ideas. That is a pretty speech, said Gia, but coming from the son of Gijira's wealthiest merchant, who is no doubt unhappy with the imperial edict to raise port duty so as to lower farmers' taxes, one rather suspects its sincerity. For a moment, it seemed as if Naroka was cowed, but he soon rallied. All men and women are driven by self-interest. Merchants are simply more honest about this fact. Without profit and trade, fields will lie fallow and mines abandoned. I think the farmers and miners who labor for their food will be very surprised to hear that you claim to be the purpose of their life. Emperor Reagan has settled veterans from the rebellion and the Chrysanthemum Dandelion War on small plots of land in the hope that they would become self-sufficient farmers leading stable lives. But unscrupulous merchants bought up these plots with the promises of quick pay, which many of the veterans quickly frittered away in gambling parlors, and now the former landowners have to scrape for a living as tenant farmers or laborers. Raising the taxes on trade was a way to stop this trend. But small family farms are not as efficient as large farms. Oh, do not lecture to me about efficiency. I know well the tricks you employ. Once you've bought up enough plots of land, you turn them into sugarcane fields or silk plantations to make more profit instead of growing rice and sorghum and vegetables. There are entire regions of Gejira where food has to be imported, a truly bizarre situation for some of the best land in Dara. Staking the lives of entire provinces on the fate of a single crop makes Dara more unstable, and when the crop fails, the unemployed laborers have to resort to banditry. We should heed the lessons taught by ancient Tiro states of Dio and Chaos well, for Chaos fell due to being dependent on Dio for grain shipments. Regional self-sufficiency is not desirable, Your Imperial Majesty. You speak of ancient Dio and Chaos, but the patterns of more recent history support my view. Rima declined because it strove for self-sufficiency and achieved only stagnation. Emperor Ragin's Dasu, on the other hand, rose in part because of the pursuit of commerce. At this point, Emperor Reagan chimes in, Kogo, do you still remember those authentic Dasu cooks you trained? Prime Minister Kogo Yelu smiled and inclined his head. I vaguely remember this. I think that Kyle isn't in the chat anymore. Because I feel like they were purposely sending out authentic Dasu cooks for some like gain in the war, and I cannot remember what it was. So this is something I'm pretty sure that he's referencing that we have seen, but I don't remember what it is. So Empress Gia continues on, your arguments dance from fluxism to incentivism and then to patternism. Yet at its heart, trade is exploitation. When the harvest is good in Gefika, you lower the prices you offer so that the farmers barely make more than they do in other years. When locusts strike to Noah, you raise the prices you demand so that families must choose between going into debt or starvation. The very word trade is a misnomer. You prey upon misery. Why is it that the farmers of Kokru who till the fields still go hungry while the merchants of Gon dress in silk and eat meat at every meal? Yo, this bitch is anti-capitalism and I'm fucking here for it, friends. I love it. She's like, seize the means of the manufacturing and production. Why are they slaving in the fields and fucking starving to death while your rich asses are out here dressed up, drinking, and not caring that they're dying of... It's so good. I love Gia right now so much. I love it so much. She's so wonderful. I knew I liked her, but this just really like cements it for me. And this dude says that is but the natural consequence. And she interrupts him. That is but the natural consequence. Like, it really is so gross when people just try and act like, well, you know, that's just what happens. Yeah, that's what happens when your system sucks and is shitty and doesn't make sense and is unjust. You're damn right. That's what happens when people don't give a fuck about taking care of one another. You're right. Totally correct. Also, maybe we shouldn't do it then. How about that? If this is a natural consequence, maybe that's an indicator that this whole system is garbage and needs to be burned the fuck down. Just saying. So she tells him to shut the fuck up and wants to know who put him forth for this examination. And it turns out that it was Queen Jin. She's like really, really shitty in this moment. Gin is like, she says, Lady Gia, I apologize for the rash way this young man from my fief spoke. And Gia and Luan is off to the side watching this. And he like freezes. And so does everybody in the room. And the Empress says, Lady Gia? Forgive me, your Imperial Majesty, said Queen Gin, pronouncing the honorific stiffly. Sometimes it's hard to change old habits. My mind still acts as it did in the days of old, when the Emperor was just Lord Garou and I his marshal. Still seated, she bowed to the Empress, though not very deeply, as her stiff ceremonial armor allowed her only a soldier's greeting. The sheathed sword on her waist clanged against the stone floor, and the sound reverberated in the grand audience hall. Soto shook her head and muttered, foolish. Timu and Firo looked at her, uncomprehending, but Thera was thinking, is she talking about Mother or Queen Gin? I think she was talking about Queen Gin, but I could see her talking about Gia and being like, you didn't need to do this confrontation up in front of everybody. Like, maybe this wasn't the way you wanted to handle this. So Gia continues on with, I hear that you canceled the plan to renovate the palace in Nokita this year. Is the treasury of Gajira in need of assistance? And Gin's like, oh, thanks for your concern, but we're fine. I follow the example of the Emperor. A fine palace for me is not as important as the welfare of the people. And Chia says, then you're to be commended for upping your contribution to the Imperial Treasury this year without increasing the burden on your people. I know my duty, said Gin evenly. Though it was impossible to see the expression on Emperor Reagan's face, the way the crown's dangling cowrie strands suddenly clinked against each other was audible to those closest to him. Luanzia looked at Gin, the grimace on his face growing more pronounced. What was that exchange about? Asked Firo. If the Emperor has issued an edict to increase port duties, wouldn't you expect the taxes collected to go up? And the portion of taxes turned over to the Imperial Treasury would also go up. Oh, right. I love this part. So she's fucking Timu. Timu, you little goober. You are so dumb. Prime Minister Kogoyelu is wise to have designed a taxation scheme that harmonizes the needs of the emperor with the needs of the provinces and fiefs, said Timu. This is just as it should be. Soto looked at him. And you've heard nothing in that exchange that you find odd? Timu looked back at her, his face confused. I do not like riddles, Lady Soto. Soto sighed inwardly again. Gia has a difficult task in front of her with this child. Thera jumped in. Why would Queen Gin have to put off plans to renovate her palace if the tax revenues were up? Soto turned to her and smiled. A very good question. Timu struggled to make sense of this. Are you accusing Queen Gin of refusing to implement the imperial edict and paying the expected increase in the portion that is due the imperial treasury out of her own pocket? Why would she do that? I can only explain so much, thought Soto. I can't hold your hand every step of the way. But Thera came to her brother's rescue. Because she feels the imperial edict is wrong, or because she wants her people to like her, even more than they like father. Either way, mother doesn't like it. So, Gin is subsidizing the merchants. That's what's going on here. She's providing a tax break and trying to undermine the emperor while doing it. It's a bad look. And I think that this is something that honestly was not well thought out on her part, because Kuni wants so much to reward the people who stood by him. He's serious about loyalty. But somebody doing this sort of underhanded shit is really not his bag. Like, he likes cleverness, but when it looks like somebody is doing something to be more like passive aggressive than really ingenious, and they haven't come to him directly with their concerns about the thing, that's, I think, where he starts to draw the line. It's one thing to be like, oh, I'm going to accomplish this by going through slightly less conventional means. And it's another thing like, I don't like what you told me to do. I'm not going to tell you or talk to you about it, but I'm definitely just going to not do it and figure out a way completely around it. And not only am I going to find a way around it, all of the people in my area that I rule are going to know that I found a way around it. I will make sure they're aware of it so that I look better than you do. This is like, there are so many layers to this whole thing being really just not, it was not well thought through. I don't think Gin maybe knew. I don't know, but I'm curious here on whether or not Gin knew that Gia was fully aware of what it was she was pulling. I'm wondering if Gin is intending for them to know. Does she want them to be aware of it and to cause this sort of like confrontation so that everybody hears that she was willing to shoulder the burden of the extra taxes? Does she feel like this is good PR for her? Or is she startled that Gia sort of outed her in front of Kuni like this? I am real curious about what each of them thought was going to happen when they started this conversation and how they felt after it ended and where it wound up. So Kuni tells this dude, Naroka, you may join the College of Advocates. I suspect your perspective will be of great use to everyone at court. This was certainly not the result Naroka had expected. He stood up and bowed deeply to the emperor and sat back down. Empress Gia resolutely refused to look at him. So I don't know about the College of Advocates. I don't remember what that means. I'm going to guess this isn't nearly the elevation that he expected. But, there it is. So then Zato goes on to announce Zomi Kidosu of Dasu. Her essay was written in a rough and indelicate hand, yet there was something powerful in the carved logograms that reminded me of the finest stone calligraphers of Zana from centuries ago, who worked with a difficult material in an uncultivated land. I was surprised to find that Her essay was bold and original, harmonizing the Fluxists with the moralists in a way I have never seen before. I think her proposal for reviving the simpler rituals of the Anno sages of old is well worth listening to. So he straight up picked her not having any idea that she was a woman. And this is somebody who put up a big fight with Gin being elevated to marshal, and then finally came around to realizing, like, oh, well, maybe it's all right. And he, like, used a lot of his scholarship to argue the point that she shouldn't be elevated this way. But then once it was clear they were going to go ahead and do it, whether he liked it or not, all of a sudden his interpretations of that scholarship changed to be like, well, maybe it's okay after all. And Gin sort of like laughs to herself at the fact that depending on whose hands it's in, words can kind of mean anything you want them to mean, which is so fucking true. So Luan is watching and is just fucking delighted. Apparently he did not know that Zomi was here, that she got through. And when Zomi stands up, she is a mess. It says the hem of her plain hempen robe was frayed. Her leggings showed through a rip. Bits of a harness around her left leg also peeked out, which explained her limping gait. Why are you dressed so poorly? Asked Emperor Reagan. Because I am poor, said Zomi. Zato Ruthie glared at the officials behind the kneeling scholars who were supposed to be in charge of teaching the Panameji court protocol for today. We offered to buy her a formal dress for today, said one of them in a trembling voice, but she refused. A piece of jade wrapped in a dust rag remains a piece of jade, but dog turds wrapped in silk will still stink up the room. After a stunned moment of silence, Consort Rasana's laughter rang out in the audience hall. The other Panameji, finally realizing that they had been insulted, turned to stare at Zomi angrily. Smiling behind the curtain of cowrie strands, Kuni leaned forward and said, "Why don't you share with all of us your proposal for reforming Dara?" So at this point, I'm like, oh boy, we're gonna get it. Nope, we don't. At this point, the kids that are watching everything from behind the throne are interrupted by their tiniest sibling, Farah, who is 4 years old, running in and being like, "Are you playing hide and seek?" and yelling it very loud so that it's pretty much assured everybody in the grand audience hall also heard it. And they're standing there like, shit, we're going to get in so much trouble. One of the maids who was supposed to be looking after the little girl is like, I swear to God, I turned away for a second and she just fucking sprinted. So at this point, Soto is about to tell the children to go and she'll deal with the emperor being mad on her own. But Thera grabs Farah and says, "Yeah, we're playing hide and seek and we just found you." And she says, "But I found you. It's opposites day. Play along with me." She gestured for Firo and Timu to leave. Then Thera pulled the door leading into the grand audience room open, took a breath and shouted, "Are you there, Adatika? What a nice hiding spot you found. I'm sure I wouldn't have found you if you hadn't cried out. Now, where does this door lead to?" And that is the end of the chapter. Y'all, I was so mad. I'm so mad. I just want to know so much what she says. And I love this like bit where Thera's like, "Oh, it's so weird. What's beyond this door?" And sends her brothers away. Thera, girl, you know where it leads? It leads to the fucking audience room where the throne is at. And that's where you should go. And we all know it. Everybody knows it. He knows it. She knows it. I know it. You know it. We all know it. Please, Kuni, make her the fucking empress and pass over Timu, who is adorable and very stupid. Timu just does not have the fucking comprehension. His mind does not work the way it needs to work to be effective like this. It is just really... he will be eaten alive and the country will suffer. It will be bad for everybody. And I think Timu will be deeply unhappy also, is the other thing. You know, like there's more to be considered here than just what is supposed to be prescribed by tradition. He isn't, just because he is supposed to be the one, because he's the oldest. You've never been somebody to bow to convention, Kuni. So just, do everybody a favor and be unconventional again. Just go ahead and stick with that pattern. And I don't think anybody will be surprised. And I feel like if Soto is much more trusted by Gia, right? She is not somebody who's like considered at all on Rosana's side, which is a shame, because if she were seen more as like a neutral party, I think that their conversations about the children and where their strengths lie would be profitable. I wish that these parents were capable of being not only a little more objective about their children's abilities, but also I wish that these parents were able to divorce their own interests from where their children are assigned, because they are clearly each sort of seeing things as like, if my son is elevated, that means that I am preferred by Kuni and I have more power. And it's too bad that it's seen that way by them, because that's not necessarily true. Everybody's abilities and gifts are very different. And that doesn't mean that any of them is less valuable than another. It just means that some people are better for one thing than others, and it's fine, Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there is a possibility that Timu could grow to learn to think this way, but the fact that it's something that would have to be taught feels like an indicator that it's not going to be, it won't come naturally to him, and he won't be as adept at it because it's not naturally how his mind works. But yeah, so that's the end of the chapter. So I'm looking to see when the next episode is. Let's see, what is today? The 2nd. Oh, good. There's one next week, 11/9. So that'll be chapters 14 and 15. So I'm glad I get to read the next one very soon. All right, everybody. Well, thank you again so much for listening. Thank you to Kyle for commissioning the other episode and allowing me to make it up to him with this one. Apologies on what happened with the other one. I had no idea that was recording like that, but what are you going to do? And I'm very excited to continue on. So until then, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.